The lawyer's voice echoed in the silent room as he read the final clause of Richard's will. "And finally, I leave the entirety of my estate, including our home, investments, and all personal property, to the woman who truly loved me, Martha Jenkins." I sat frozen in my chair, the words hitting me like physical blows. Martha Jenkins? Richard's secretary of 15 years? Not me, Caroline Mitchell, his wife of 22 years? The faces around the table swam in my vision, our children, David and Eliza, now in their early 20s, looking confused and alarmed. Richard's sister Judith, her mouth hanging open in shock. And Martha herself, sitting across from me, her eyes downcast, fingers twisting the tissue in her hands. Has a betrayal ever blindsided you completely? Have you discovered a painful truth about a relationship you thought was secure? Share your story in the comments below. I'd love to know which city you're listening from and if anything like this has happened to you. If you enjoy this story, don't forget to support me by sending a super thanks so I can keep bringing more stories like this to you. My name is Caroline Mitchell. I am 64 years old, and until that moment I thought I knew my marriage. I was wrong. Richard and I met when I was 39 and he was 42. Both of us were divorced, both wary of love, both successful in our careers, I as a pediatrician with my own practice, he as the owner of a regional insurance company. We bonded over our shared love of classical music and hiking in the mountains outside our Colorado hometown. Our wedding was small but elegant. I remember the certainty I felt that day that this marriage would be different from my first, that Richard was different from my first husband. We moved into his sprawling Tudor home, blended our families, built what I thought was a solid life together. When Richard hired Martha as his executive assistant, I felt only gratitude. She was efficient, dedicated, and seemingly devoted to making Richard's professional life run smoothly. When she began handling our family's social calendar, I welcomed the help. When she remembered all our birthdays and anniversaries with thoughtful gifts, I considered myself lucky that Richard had such a conscientious employee. The cancer diagnosis came 3 years ago, pancreatic, stage 4, terminal. Richard faced it with the same stoic practicality he'd approached everything in life. He arranged his affairs, stepped back from his company, and focused on spending his remaining time with family. During his 18-month battle with the disease, Martha was a constant presence. She coordinated his medical appointments, organized his medications, brought meals to our home. I was grateful for her help as I balanced my medical practice and caring for Richard. When he died 6 weeks ago, Martha was there at the hospital, as was I. I'd stepped out briefly to call the children, and when I returned, Richard was gone. Martha was holding his hand, tears streaming down her face. I thought they were the tears of a devoted employee losing a respected boss. Now, sitting in the attorney's office, I realized how blind I had been. "There must be some mistake," David said, breaking the stunned silence. My son, so like his father in appearance, leaned forward. "Mr. Calloway, surely my father meant to provide for my mother?" Gerald Calloway, Richard's attorney for the past 30 years, cleared his throat uncomfortably. "The will is quite clear, I'm afraid. Your father made these changes 8 months ago, of sound mind and with proper witnesses." 8 months, I whispered, while Richard was sick, while I was caring for him, loving him, grieving his impending loss. Martha finally looked up, her face pale. "Caroline, I didn't know. I swear I didn't know he was going to do this." I found that hard to believe. "You've been named the sole beneficiary of my husband's estate, and you didn't know?" "He asked me to witness a change to his will," she said, her voice barely audible, "but he didn't tell me what the change was." Our daughter Eliza stood abruptly, her chair scraping back. "This is insane. Dad wouldn't do this. He wouldn't leave Mom with nothing." But apparently, he had. The Tudor home we'd shared for 22 years, the vacation cabin in Aspen, the insurance company valued at over $12 million. The investment accounts, the cars, the art collection we'd built together, all of it now belonged to Martha Jenkins. "Actually, Mr. Calloway interjected carefully, "Mrs. Mitchell isn't left entirely without provision. There is a separate trust established for her lifetime medical care and a modest monthly stipend." "How modest?" I asked, my voice sounding strange to my own ears. $5,000 per month. Under any other circumstances, $5,000 monthly would be a generous sum, but compared to the lifestyle Richard and I had shared and the millions he had left to his secretary, it felt like a deliberate insult. "Mom still has her practice," David said, reaching for my hand, "and will help, of course." I nodded mechanically, but my mind was racing. I had scaled back my practice significantly during Richard's illness. Many of my patients had found other doctors. At 64, rebuilding would be challenging. "I don't understand the wording," Judith said suddenly. "The woman who truly loved me. What does that even mean?" All eyes turned to Martha, who flushed deeply. "We weren't having an affair," she said quickly. "It wasn't like that." "Then what was it like?" I asked, finding my voice at last. "What did my husband mean by truly loved?" Martha looked at me directly for the first time. "Richard said you loved the life he provided, not him, that you loved the doctor's wife, the company owner's wife, the society woman. Not Richard Mitchell, the man." The accusation hit me like a physical blow. 22 years of marriage dismissed as shallow and materialistic, 22 years of partnership reduced to a transaction. "That's not true," I said, my voice shaking. "I loved him. I took care of him when he was sick." "You hired nurses for the difficult parts," Martha said quietly. "You kept working. You maintained your schedule of charity events and social obligations." "Because he asked me to." My voice rose despite my efforts to stay calm. Richard insisted I keep my practice. He insisted life continue as normally as possible. Martha just looked at me sadly, as if I had missed something fundamental about the man I'd been married to for over 2 decades. The meeting concluded in a blur. Mr. Calloway promised to send all relevant documents to my personal attorney for review. Martha slipped out quickly, avoiding eye contact with everyone. My children flanked me protectively as we walked to the parking lot, both assuring me that we would fight this, that it couldn't possibly be legal. But I knew Richard. If he had made this decision, he would have made it ironclad. That night, alone in the guest bedroom of David's home, I lay awake trying to make sense of what had happened. Had I really not known my husband at all? Had I truly failed to love him in the way he needed? The next morning I called my own attorney, Jessica Lang, who had handled my first divorce and had become a friend over the years. "This is outrageous," she said after I explained the situation. "We'll contest it immediately. Richard can't just disinherit his spouse in favor of an employee. Colorado has spousal elective share laws." I felt a flicker of hope. "What does that mean?" "It means that regardless of what a will says, a surviving spouse is entitled to a percentage of the estate, usually around 50%, depending on the length of the marriage." "So this will wasn't legal?" Jessica hesitated. "It's legal, but you have the right to claim your elective share instead of accepting the provisions in the will. However," she continued more carefully, "there are complications. If most of Richard's assets were held in trusts or certain types of accounts with designated beneficiaries, those might bypass the probate process entirely." "And would that affect my claim?" "Potentially, yes. I need to see all the documents before I can give you a clear answer." Later that day, a courier delivered a large envelope from Gerald Calloway's office. Inside were copies of Richard's will, trust documents, and a sealed personal letter addressed to me in Richard's handwriting. I stared at the envelope for a long time before opening it. The familiar script, once strong and bold, now showed the tremors of his illness. "Caroline, if you're reading this, you've just learned about my decision regarding my estate. I know you're hurt and angry. I understand those feelings, but I need you to understand mine. When I was diagnosed, something changed between us. Not suddenly, but I finally saw clearly what I'd suspected for years. You were an excellent wife in many ways, organized, socially graceful, intelligent, attractive. You played the role perfectly, but that's what it was to you, a role. When I needed a wife who could set aside appearances and just be present with me in my illness and fear, you responded by becoming more perfect, more organized, more in control. You hired the best nurses, researched the best treatments, maintained our social standing, but you couldn't sit with me in the dark at 3 a.m. when I was terrified of dying. You couldn't let me see you messy or uncertain or afraid. Martha could. She saw me the real me, not the successful businessman, not the provider, not the social asset, just Richard, scared and dying. She loved me for myself, not for what I could give her or what I represented. I'm not punishing you, Caroline. The medical trust will ensure you're cared for, and the monthly stipend is actually more than we lived on when we first married. You still have your practice, your separate investments, your family. What I'm doing is acknowledging a truth we both avoided for 22 years. We had a marriage of convenience and compatibility, not deep love. And at the end of my life, I wanted to acknowledge the woman who did truly love me. I'm sorry if this hurts you. That was never my intention. Richard. I read the letter 3 times, my hands shaking more with each reading. The words swam before my eyes as memories cascaded through my mind, moments when Richard had reached for my hand and I'd been checking my phone. Nights I'd slept in the guest room because his medication made him restless. Dinners where we'd sat in silence, each lost in our own thoughts. Had I really been so absent? Had I truly failed to love him as a person rather than a provider? The thought haunted me as I drove to Martha's apartment the next day. I needed to see her, to understand what Richard had seen in her that he hadn't found in me. She answered the door looking tired and wary. Her apartment was small but tidy, nothing like the luxury she would soon be able to afford. "Caroline," she said, clearly surprised. Come in." I stepped inside, noting the modest furnishings, the stack of medical books on the coffee table, the framed photo of Martha with Richard at what appeared to be a company picnic, both of them laughing. "I got a letter from Richard," I said without preamble. "He said you saw him, the real him. What did that mean exactly?" Martha sank onto her sofa, gesturing for me to take the chair opposite. "It wasn't an affair," she repeated, "not physically, but emotionally." She nodded slowly. Richard would talk to me about his fears, his regrets, his childhood, his first marriage. Things he said he couldn't share with you because you needed him to be strong and successful and certain. "He never tried," I protested. "He never came to me with those things." "He did, in the beginning," Martha said gently. "He told me he tried for years, but you always changed the subject or offered practical solutions instead of just listening. Eventually, he stopped trying. The accusation stung because I recognized the truth in it. I'd always been a fixer, a doer, a problem solver. It was what made me a good doctor. When did that become a barrier between Richard and me?" "During his illness," Martha continued, "he would call me at night sometimes, when he couldn't sleep. We would talk for hours about death, about God, about his regrets. While I was sleeping in the next room," I said bitterly. "In the guest room," Martha corrected softly. "He told me you moved to the guest room 6 months before his diagnosis because his snoring disturbed your sleep, and you never moved back." Another truth that cut deep. I had moved to the guest room, prioritizing my rest for my practice over proximity to my husband. "What will you do with everything?" I asked, gesturing vaguely to encompass the entirety of what she'd inherited: the house, the business, the fortune. Martha looked down at her hands. "I'm selling the business. Richard knew I would. He approved the buyer before he died, his VP of operations." She paused. "The house. I thought perhaps you might want to buy it. At a fair price." I stared at her in disbelief. "You'd sell me back my own home?" "It was never really your home, was it?" Martha asked, not unkindly. "Richard said you kept it exactly as his first wife had decorated it, never changing anything to make it yours." Another truth I hadn't recognized. I had always treated the Tudor house as Richard's domain, never truly claiming it as my own. As I sat there, taking in all these painful revelations, something inside me shifted. The initial shock and humiliation of being disinherited began to crystallize into something harder, colder, more resolute. "You know what, Martha?" I said, rising to my feet. "Keep the house. Keep all of it. But you should know something." She looked up at me, wary. "Richard didn't tell you everything. There are things about him, about us, that he kept from you, just as he kept things from me." I reached into my purse and pulled out a small flash drive. Richard's company is facing a major lawsuit, a class action that hasn't gone public yet. Something he hid from everyone, including his precious VP who's buying the business. Martha's face paled. "What? No, that can't be true. Richard would have told me." "Would he? The man who kept journals you knew nothing about? The man who compartmentalized his entire life, showing different pieces to different people?" I laughed bitterly. "This drive contains all the documentation, internal emails, cover-ups, the works. I found it in his home office safe 3 days before he died." I placed the flash drive on her coffee table. The business you're selling, it'll be worthless in 6 months. The legal bills alone will bankrupt it. Why are you telling me this? Martha whispered. Because you were right about one thing. I am practical, and practicality demands I let you know what you're really inheriting. I moved toward the door. Oh, and the Tudor house? It has black mold in the foundation. Richard knew. We'd been planning to sell it ourselves before his diagnosis. These weren't vindictive lies. They were painful truths Richard had kept from Martha, just as he had kept emotional truths from me. In his compartmentalized life, he had shown each of us only what he wanted us to see. Neither of us had known the complete man. Caroline, Martha called as I reached the door. I really did love him. I turned back to her. I'm sure you did, but you loved a version of Richard that was no more complete than the version I knew. He played us both, Martha. He punished me for not being the emotional support he wanted, and he's rewarding you with a poison gift. Over the following months, my prediction came true. The lawsuit against Richard's company became public, and its value plummeted. Martha was left with massive legal bills and a business rapidly bleeding money. The house, which she'd planned to sell, languished on the market once the mold issue was discovered during inspection. Jessica, my attorney, worked tirelessly and managed to secure me a settlement that, while not half the estate's original value, was substantial enough to ensure my financial security. The legal battle was costly for Martha, draining much of what she'd inherited. I rebuilt my pediatric practice, focusing on underserved communities where my skills were desperately needed. I bought a small, beautiful home in a different city, one I decorated entirely to my own tastes. I reconnected with old friends and made new ones, building a life centered on my own values and desires rather than someone else's expectations. David and Eliza eventually reconciled with me, though our relationship remained strained for years. They couldn't understand why I'd fought so hard against Martha, why I couldn't just move on gracefully. They hadn't read Richard's letter. They didn't know how deeply his words had cut. 5 years after Richard's death, I received a letter from Martha. She had sold what remained of the company for a fraction of its original value and moved to another state. The Tudor house had finally sold at a significant loss. She was starting over, just as I had. Caroline, she wrote, I realize now that Richard wasn't fair to either of us. He gave me a glimpse of his vulnerability that he denied you, and he gave you years of partnership he denied me. In the end, he punished you for failings he never clearly communicated, and he rewarded me with a burden I wasn't prepared to carry. Neither of us truly knew him. Perhaps no one did. I never responded to her letter. There was nothing left to say. Richard's final act hadn't been about love or truth. It had been about control. Even in death, he had sought to orchestrate our lives, to force us into roles of his choosing. But I had refused to play the role of the gracious, forgiven widow. I had fought back, protected myself, and built a new life on my own terms. In doing so, I had discovered a strength I hadn't known I possessed. My husband's will left everything to the woman who truly loved him, and it wasn't me. But in the end, what mattered more was learning to truly love myself. If you enjoyed my story, please don't forget to like, subscribe to my channel, and hit the notification bell so you never miss my new life stories. Your support means everything to me and helps me continue sharing these real experiences. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you in the next video.